Hi, my name is Andrea. I happen to be the art gallery coordinator here at the museum. We are going to have a presentation tonight by three men that have had special experiences going to the other countries and seeing what people have done with nuclear energy. So I'd like to introduce Forrest Lloyd. He went to Chernobyl, and John Carlick happened to be the lead on the trip. Okay, and then Matt Anderson has not been to Chernobyl, but he's been to Hanford, Los Alamos, and a couple of other sites. And so they're going to talk about different experiences that humans have had dealing with nuclear energy and some of the mishaps. So I'm going to just leave it at that for now. Okay, Forrest?
Did you wear that shirt specifically for today?
Yes.
Very appropriate.
Okay.
Okay, well, what a crowd here. I appreciate all of you coming out. This trip was one of the most fascinating and interesting trips, I think, of my life. And I'm surprised and overjoyed, I guess, by the interest in our community, people that are interested in this material. So glad to have you all here. Let me ask a question. Did anyone go to the USO? I gave a presentation over there. Do we have anybody from that? We have one person, two people. We got three people. Okay, so we got three. What we've done, I gave this before, but we tried to make some changes to it so the people that came here would get a little bit different experience. So there'll be a little bit of overlap, but there'll also be a lot of new material. So the way I would like to do this is very informal. If people have questions during the presentation, they can ask the questions, put their hand up, and that way we can deal with questions as they come up. Can't guarantee we're going to answer all of them, but there's three of us here, and between the three of us, we're going to do our best to answer, and if we can't, if someone in the audience can, then there's an opportunity for someone to share and give us some useful information. So this right here is let's see, do you want to, Matt's going to do, I'm going to do part of this, and Matt's going to do part of it. Matt, you want to say a few words?
No, we'll
We'll wait? Okay, all right. So this is a flyer, and Peter Brown, I think everybody knows Peter Brown in this room. Peter, put your hand up. Peter and John are good friends, and Peter invited John to Rotary to give a presentation on an earlier trip to Chernobyl. And I was interested in all that, and Peter says, I'll let you know when John's going to do his next. Well, what, about 6-7 months ago, Peter said, yep, we're making another trip. This is a flyer he gave me. So my brother was interested in going, so my brother and I signed up. Peter and his sons signed up. Regretfully, Peter had some health issues and he had to back out. So when we went out, Peter will share everything we got here.
If you go anywhere, that's good.
Yeah, okay. So there's the flyer. Let me get this. This is, well, I've pretty much covered that already. The accident happened on April 26th of 1986, so that's quite a while ago. Oh, I'm not speaking into the mic, sorry about that. Okay, a little bit about John. John's well educated, he's well qualified to take us all on this trip. As you can see, he's got a PhD in environmental science, a master's in horticulture, and you can read the rest. This is a group that went. I think there's probably 12 of us in there, and you can see John's over there. And Sergei, we're going to talk more about him. He was the actual person that lives in the Ukraine that actually took us on the tour. Here's a map of Eastern Europe, and just wanted to kind of give you overview of where we were in the Ukraine. And then I got a blow up here. This is the Ukraine itself. So we flew into Kiev right here and spent a couple days there getting used to the time change and the climate. The climate's a little different than Ridgecrest. And ran between 30 and 40 degrees. We were all dressed for it, wasn't a problem.
This was November or December?
This was November. Yes, late November. I think I got back just before Thanksgiving. And then we went up to Chernobyl up here, spent 2 days up there in the exclusion zone, came back to Kiev, spent a couple days in Kiev and came home. Just wanted to show you a few pictures of Kiev. It's a beautiful city. It's a clean city. A lot of activity, a lot of people coming and going. And Eastern Orthodox Church is very strong there. And the churches all seem to have about the same architecture. So that kind of stood out. Okay, Sergei was in the Soviet Army. And if I understand it right, when he was not in the Army, I think at the time that this accident happened, and he was activated into the Army when this accident happened. And his expertise, he knows a lot about radiation, and he set policies and procedures in place to try to keep people from getting more radiation than was safe. I think a lot of people got unsafe amounts of radiation over there. But he's very aware of that, and he was our guide, and he made sure that we didn't get radiated while we were there. He wanted us to come home, and he didn't want us to glow in the dark. This is a picture of the exclusion zone. A lot of people here are familiar with our range here in the base. This exclusion zone is 40 miles by 80 miles. That's twice as large as our base, our range on the base. So that gives you some feeling for the real estate that's part of the exclusion zone. There's a few people living in it, but it's a very, very small number. And there are a couple places where it's safe. We'll get into that a little bit later. There's the unit that had the accident. And if you look at this right here, this is a sarcophagus that they built, that the Russian army built. They used 500,000 men over a 9-month period to build this unit, this device or this cover. There's very little engineering in it. They didn't have the time to do that, so they just got a bunch of people, and they got steel and concrete, and they started covering up this mess. And that's what, when they got that cover on, that's what held a lot of the radioactive material and debris and stuff from getting out and spreading across Europe. So they were under the time, a real gun to get that all done. And it's in pretty bad shape. Because it wasn't engineered, it's starting to fall apart. There's a lot of radiation inside that is damaging the concrete and damaging the steel. And so it's not expected to last much longer. It's going to have to be replaced.
When did they put that up?
They put that up within 9 months of the accident. They started immediately. First thing was to go in there and try to cover the nuclear pile with lead and sand and borax, or a whole bunch of stuff. And they brought a bunch of helicopter pilots in from the war in Afghanistan. So you recall back during those days they were fighting in Afghanistan. Brought a lot of those people back, and they flew in helicopters and dropped that stuff over that. And when they dropped it over, they were looking right down into the pile. So those pilots must have gotten a huge amount of radiation.
So what about the workers, the people that actually built that?
Well, what they did is they had a bivouac area, and they bring Russian soldiers in, and they would work until they got their whatever they considered was the maximum amount of radiation they could handle, and then they would leave, and another person would come in and take their place. So the bivouac area, I've got pictures, but I didn't bring them in, but it covers a huge area. And the Army just, set up bivouac there and started rotating the military people through, and when they got so much radiation, they moved on. Yes?
They still wear radiation suits and all that stuff?
I looked this up on the internet, and they had, people would take lead. Like one of the worst jobs was when this top blew off, and they were in there trying to clean up. There was a lot of graphite that was terribly radioactive, and the people would put lead all over their body, and they'd go up there and they'd work for maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and then they were done. They got a huge amount of radiation in that short period of time. Some of the people who were initially exposed got sunburns, and of course some of them died. There was an article that I read where when this thing went off, there were people in the town nearby, and what they saw was this, it looked almost like a spotlight that was shining straight up in the sky, and it was all kinds of different colors. And what that really was atomic particles that were overheated, were just shooting up into the upper atmosphere. And there was a group of people standing on a bridge some distance away, and they watched this thing and they thought that was the absolute most beautiful thing they ever saw. And apparently none of those people survived. Yeah, so it was pretty ugly. So anyway, I took this picture. I was probably about 75 or 100 yards away, and where we were at, we were safe there for probably 8 hours, and then we would receive enough radiation where we'd need to go home. They have a wall. There's a lot of workers working there to clean this mess up, and this is a wall that's halfway between where we were at and the unit itself. And I think if you were on this side of it, I think you could work out there for 6 hours a day. And then if you were on the other side, you could only work there for 2 hours a day. So you can see that you can see the manpower necessary to just do a small amount of work. It's labor intensive.
Forrest, what? They let you stand, they said you could be there for 8 hours?
Well,
Taking the picture?
I'm estimating that based on the fact that they have an office there, and people go there and they work for 8 hours, and then they go home. And if you go just like from here to that wall, back wall back here, you're limited to 6 hours. And then if you go on the other side of the wall, by the way, this wall was put in halfway. I believe it was put there so that a lot of the work that you didn't have to do right next to the reactor, you'd have this wall so you could work for a longer period of time. So at least that's my take on it. What I've done here is I put a picture of a nuclear plant like we have here in the United States. This is not a model that closely matches the one, we'll see, I'll show you another model later on. But this particular model, I'm just using it as a guide to kind of make you familiar with the tests that they were conducting when this problem happened. There's your generator. There's a steam turbine here. This right here is a nuclear reactor. And the water that runs through this nuclear reactor is not the same, steam. This turns to steam over here. But the water that runs through the reactor and the water that turns the steam to go through the turbine is not, they're completely different. They're isolated from one another. This is not true of the one in Russia. In the one in Russia, it's all one system. So the water that heats up inside a nuclear reactor goes through the turbine, and over time the turbine gets nuclear hot. So I don't know what their plans, the details of their plans were for that, but we have some of those problems in this country, because sometimes the heat exchanger will start leaking, and some of the water that goes through the reactor gets into the water, turns the steam through the reactor, and our reactors start to get hot, and then they got to go in and replace those heat exchangers. So those are some of the problems we have. But what the purpose of the test was, they wanted to find out if they were to disconnect from the grid, which means you get a lot of, the load is taken off the generator, and if you were to sever this pipe or turn it off so that no steam can get into the turbine and the generator are spinning. They're heavy, they're massive, and they're spinning. They wanted to find out if they could do that and then shut down the nuclear reactor down here and get enough electricity out of the motor generator with a centrifugal force in order to be able to shut the reactor down before they ran out of power. That was the test being conducted. And the test was a failure. And the reason it was a failure is because the person operating the reactor didn't know how to shut it down properly, didn't understand it, and the reactor overheated and blew up before they could complete the test.
Wow.
So I don't know, I guess none of us know if that test would have been successful or not had the person that was operating it knew what they were doing.
Excuse me, you hear that what the crew doing this was sort of cowboys in our parlance. Yeah. They just were sort of playing around. Yeah.
Well, it was a formal test, It's a test that they had planned on doing before they started it up. They needed the power, they got impatient, they went ahead and started it up. I don't think that's the problem. The test, I don't think, is a problem. The problem is, apparently what I read was that the person who was in charge of this was connected with the KGB. He had lots of power. I don't think he had the skills in nuclear physics. I doubt that he had a thermodynamics background. I don't think he understood how to operate powerhouses. And when he started to shut this thing down, Matt is going to get into this in a lot more detail, but he didn't understand all this, and then things went out of control. And what's interesting is the problem we had at 3 Mile Island is very similar to this one. We had an operator that didn't know what they were doing. They had a meltdown internally. We had a container that held everything in. When our guy messed up, we gave him a golden pocket watch and sent him down the road and told him not to talk to anybody. Over there, they put the operator in prison. And I guess he's out now for health reasons. So that's how the two societies, I guess, deal with people who make mistakes. We do it, I guess we do it different. So Matt will get into this a lot more detail. Okay, this in the visitor center, they built a model of what they think is inside, and so you can kind of orientate yourself. This is hinged over here. There's a hinge there and a hinge over here, and they can close that up, but they open it up so you can look inside and see what's inside. So when it's closed, oops, I hit the wrong button. This tank is actually part of. You can see the other half of the tank over here. Where is it? Oh, up here, up here. So this tank and this tank is actually one tank when you close it. And this is a reactor right here that blew up. And when this thing blew up, well, let Matt get it. Matt will cover that when he gets up here. This is a major disaster. Affects the whole world. There's 36 countries involved in fixing this problem. When I look at the economic situation in Ukraine, it's clear that they're not coming up with much money to fix this thing. They don't have it. I suspect that the USSR doesn't. And it's the rest of the world that's putting up the money and the engineering talent to try to clean this mess up. So these are some of the contractors involved in it. Okay, this is incredible. This is a cover that they're building. And they're building it away from the reactor. If you look at it, the reactor's over here. They're building this thing, stainless steel, and when they get it done, they're going to slide it over the old sarcophagus. And then when they get it over and they get it completely covered, then they plan on completely dismantling it, breaking that thing down into little pieces, putting it into lead boxes or whatever they do, and go bury it someplace. So that's their solution, and that's the same thing that we did at 3 Mile Island. We completely tore that unit down and hauled it off and buried it. Now it's still radioactive down in the pit where that unit was. I suspect that they'll have some of that here when they're done. This device is going to have big air handlers in it. They've got a lot of water in the reactor. They want to get the water out of there. There's a lot of dust. It's highly radioactive. They want to put filters in there and collect all that dirt and water and seal it up and take it away. So there's a lot of, and I don't think they plan on having people inside this thing. This is going to be done, I'm assuming, all remote control. So this is what it looked like, I think, April of 2014. New York. This is a New York Times photo. This is a picture of it. This is a picture that I took from the town, and you can see that they're starting to fill in the back, and they're hoping to have this completed within the next, I don't know, 10 or 12 months. And it's designed to last 120 years. They're not sure if they can fix this thing or clean this mess up in that length of time. They're still doing research on how to do the cleanup. So it's not a matter of just building and doing. They got to build, and they're doing research. And of course, they're running against the clock for getting this done because they want to get this in place before that old unit, that old roof falls in. Let's see. Matt, you want to take over?
Forrest, before you leave, I have a question. They talk, and maybe Matt will get to this, do they talk about topsoil removal that was done right after the accident?
I can't speak to that. John, is that something you can speak to?
Could you restate the question, please?
On your trip, did they talk about the topsoil removal that was done all through the exclusion zone and the burying of that topsoil?
Well, the answer is yes, and...
John, why don't you come up here and talk so we can get you on tape?
Yeah, you gotta stand right in front of the microphone, John.
Здравствуйте, добро пожаловать. I'm wearing my Chernobyl liquidator medal tonight for this occasion. I wasn't there, but one of our group participants was kind enough to find it in a souvenir shop. And they have properly represented alpha, gamma, and beta radiation on this medal. So anyway, a little trivia. To go to your question, the first trip we made, we were able to visit the trenches in which the waste had been buried, and we were able, for a small extra fee paid in cash, to visit the military graveyard where the Hind gunship bodies and the trucks and so forth had been stored. So that has been addressed. And we also saw on this trip the containment building for the spent fuel. So we were able to see some of those things, and on another slide at another time, I could show you the diagram of the trenches and where things were buried. But indeed, what we call the red forest, which is the pine forest that was killed directly by radiation, that was cut down and buried, and a new forest now has taken its place. This is spelled with one R, not two R's, and just in reference to our first speaker. Right.
One other thing. When that the first release of energy and the air current took that over to Finland or Sweden, when they actually detected at another nuclear site.
Right.
Can you tell us about that?
Well, I don't know, Matt, are you going to discuss that? The detection of the plume? All right. The plume was detected in Sweden, and was detected at a nuclear facility in Sweden, which set off the radiation alarms. But when the isotopes were analyzed, they realized that they weren't from the kind of reactor that they were running. It had to come from an RMBK reactor, the kind that was being operated here. So at that point, the Soviet Union had to more or less make confession that something had happened. There are diagrams available, and again, I'm here just as really a guest, and I appreciate Forrest inviting me. Forrest dropped in on the horticulture class I'm offering here. It's a subtle but direct, advertisement for that. So there are some diagrams available to show where radiation was distributed throughout Europe. And I mean, you could see those somewhere if you wish, but indeed it was Sweden where that plume was noticed.
I unfortunately missed Forrest's first presentation, which was done at the USO building. I really wanted to see this because I had gone up to Hanford, where there's a number of nuclear reactors that are used primarily for the production of plutonium, which is used in atomic bombs and in hydrogen bombs. And when I was up there, I was able to buy two books. One of them is by Maureen McQuarrie, who's a school teacher in the town of Richland, Washington. And this is her book, and I read the book. It was fascinating. She had her students, 10 years after the disaster at Chernobyl, connect with the students of their same age in the town of, originally it was Pyrpyat, which is a town right next to the reactor. But they had to evacuate that town within a few hours of the accident, and no one was ever able to go back. So they built a completely new city of 50,000 people in the town of Slavutych. I don't know, it's 30 or 60 miles away from Pyrpyat, and that's where all the people moved, and they live there. So this was a fascinating book because it talked about two cultures that lived in cities that were totally dependent on nuclear plants for their income, not too dissimilar from Ridgecrest, which is totally dependent on the income from the Navy base here. The other book I read is by a guy named George Vargo, and it's titled The Chernobyl Accident. And it goes into great detail of what happened at the Chernobyl accident. And the interesting thing is, I was able to connect some of the causes of the accident at Chernobyl with some of the things I had seen when I went up to Hanford and looked at the B reactor. So I'll share that with you, and I think you may find that of some interest. And if anybody wants to look at these books, you're welcome to. Okay, so here goes. Let's start and take a look at, this is a diagram that Forrest provided to me, and it's a little closer diagram to the design of the RBMK 1000. And basically what you have here is a nuclear reactor right here, which are these purple things, which represent the uranium rods, and they're buried in a big block of basically graphite, carbon. And graphite, the way a nuclear reactor works is the uranium emits neutrons, and if they emit neutrons and they're in a highly dense form, they have a critical reaction, and more neutrons get emitted and it explodes. If you have it in a reactor like this to generate electric power, you control the amount of emission of neutrons by interjecting what they call control rods, which are also a piece of graphite. And the two main ingredients that absorb the neutrons are graphite and water. And the amount of graphite and water that you have surrounding these uranium pellets controls the amount of heat that the reactor generates. And of course, the purpose of these control rods, these long things here, are to keep the reactor cool enough and under control, but still generating enough heat to create steam. And the steam is shown in the blue here, and it goes up to here and up to here, and then turns this turbine. And then after the steam goes through the turbine, it condenses back to water, and they recirculate it back, and they inject it back through, and so it just goes around and around and around. And you keep this thing under control by injecting these control rods to slow down the nuclear reaction, or if you want to speed it up, you pull the control rods up. And of course, the design is such that if a cable were to break or something, the control rods would fall and gravity would cause the reactor to shut down, and it's supposedly safe. Now, there's some problems here. The first problem is that a nuclear reactor behaves very nicely when you start it up because you got nice pure graphite and you got pure uranium, and it depends on all these mathematical models that the physicists put together, and it works great. One of the problems with a nuclear reactor, however, is as time goes on, some of the uranium begins to decay into different elements. One of those elements is xenon. And if you get too much xenon in a nuclear reactor, xenon is an extremely good absorber of neutrons, and it'll shut that reactor down. So as a reactor ages, it accumulates more and more xenon, particularly in the center of the reactor, and its properties are less predictable and becomes less stable. That was one of the problems with the Chernobyl reactor, and as I'll talk about later in Hanford, they should have known that because the first reactor that was built in the United States, the first full-scale reactor, was at Hanford. They discovered this the first time they started it up. So I'll show you that. Anyway, I'll try to summarize what happened on the accident from what I learned in this book here. They were going to do a test, and as Forrest explains, they're going to cut off the power to the turbine and cut off the power from the electrical grid and let the turbine keep running due to its inertia, and hopefully it would generate enough electricity to keep the pumps going and the water going through it. And this KGB guy said, well, go ahead and do the test. Of course, he didn't understand the physics and the thermodynamics of an aged, unstable reactor, which is what they had at Chernobyl. So they went ahead and he ordered the test to be conducted. They went ahead and did the test. They had to first lower the power from 1,000 megawatts down to 700. And they did that by inserting the rods. And the problem was that when they inserted the rods, they thought they would get about 700 kilowatts, and the power plunged down to only 30 watts or something. And they said, oh my God, this isn't working out right. So what they did is they pulled the rods back out, and the power zoomed up to 200 kilowatts.
Megawatts?
Excuse me, megawatts, I stand corrected. And then for some reason, one of the operators pressed a manual button to move the rods down. And when he did that, 3 or 4 of the rods moved down, and when the graphite rods moved down, they absorbed neutrons, but they also displaced the water at the bottom of the tank, and water's a better absorber than graphite. So for a momentary period, it caused a spike in the power, and the power shot up to about 200 megawatts, but the power was very unevenly distributed throughout the reactor. Instead of uniformly distributed, which it would be in a new one, it was an old and unlinear distribution of power. And down at the bottom, there was a huge power spike. And it immediately boiled the water, turned to steam. The steam exploded, and it was the equivalent of about 30 tons of TNT. That explosion destroyed the reactor. And in fact, they've looked at the control assembly, and all the rods, these rods were stuck at the halfway point. And as Forrest described to me, one operator looked down from above, and he saw the tops blowing off where the control rods are supposed to be. He turned around and ran, because he knew he was getting a big dose of radiation. And I think there was one guy killed immediately. They never recovered his body. But then what happened is it started fires, and the graphite being a very pure fuel source, and all the oxygen went in there, it started numerous very, very hot fires, and it basically melted the reactor, and about, 5 to 20% of the material, the uranium, got blown up into the sky and carried by the winds throughout this exclusion zone, and it became radioactive, and it still is today. So that's my understanding of a sort of step-by-step process of what happened in the reactor. Okay, having said that, here's what it looked like after the explosion. Here's 2 views. One from, excuse me. I gotta learn how to do this laser. This is the blown up reactor. And this was unit number 4. There were 4 of these things. They kept units 3, 2, and 1 operating for many years afterwards. And there's another view of the explosion as well. And the next picture is, here's the control room in its quiescent state before the accident, showing an operator here and all the various controls. And here's what it looked like after the explosion. You can see it. It blew out a lot of the control panels.
How old was this reactor?
I don't know exactly. My impression is it had been operating for several years. It was an old design, it was a 1960s some design. And I guess it would probably have been built in the late 70s, maybe, or early 80s. And the accident was 1986, I guess. Let's see. Here's the Chernobyl power plants, and here's the city of Pyrpyat, which was a bustling city of 50,000 people, and all of these people basically supported operation of those nuclear power plants. Here's the city of Pyrpyat after the accident, a few days afterwards. You can see it's kind of a mess. They basically, within 24 hours, they realized what a horrible mess they had on their hands. They told all the residents of Pyrpyat, buses are coming, we're going to take you out of here. Hopefully you'll be back in a few days. Just grab what you can and go. And so that's what the people did. Of course, they never came back. That's what the city looked like after the after the abandonment. And now I'm going to shift gears and I'm going to talk a little bit about Hanford and try to connect the two cities for whatever interest that is. So if you look at the state of Washington here, in the southeast corner, there's a piece of land very similar to China Lake. It's high desert and a very low population. And in the beginning of World War II, the Department of Energy, Atomic Energy Commission at the time, or the Manhattan Project actually, was looking for a place where they could build a nuclear reactor and instead of generating electric power, they could convert uranium into plutonium. And plutonium is the choice material for atomic bombs. So they picked this piece of land. It's about half the size of the China Lake Range, about 500,000 acres. And it's right on the Columbia River. The Columbia River, Bonneville Dam's up here. Columbia River flows down like this through this town of Richland and on out to the Pacific Ocean. So they've got this 500,000 acres, and they built nuclear reactors right along the river because they need the water for cooling them. And those reactors are basically very similar. They're just a great big block of graphite with a bunch of holes drilled in it, and they fill the holes with tubes of uranium, slightly enriched uranium. And after they cook for a week or two, a certain amount of that uranium transforms into plutonium, and then they take the uranium rods out of these reactors, and they haul them down into this central area here, and I'll show you the plant into these conversion plants where they chemically separate the plutonium from the uranium. There's only a few percent of those rods that's converted to plutonium, so it's a very arduous and extremely hazardous, risky process because they use very toxic chemicals to separate these two, and of course it's all highly radioactive, so it all has to be done remotely. So that was the Hanford plant. The period of time that the uranium cooks can vary depending on the reactor and where the uranium rods are located, in the center or the edge, but generally a couple of weeks. And they want to pull it out when they get the maximum amount of the isotope of plutonium called plutonium 239, I think it is. That's the choice one for making atomic weapons. And you get plutonium 240 and 241 and so forth also. So this is sort of what the Hanford plant looks like. And anybody who wants to visit there, they have tours about once a month, and you can go look at things just like I did.
Where is that from Richland? I've been to Richland, but I haven't been to Hanford.
Richland is right down here at the southern end. It's about 30 miles from Richland up to the nuclear reactors and about 25 miles up to the chemical separation plants. So it's kind of similar to China Lake. You know, the city of Ridgecrest is right at the south edge of the range. And then all the stuff happens up on the northern part of the range. And the reason it's designed this way, of course, is that if there's an accident in any of these places, it's far enough away from the population center. Okay, so here we see the Columbia River coming flowing down. This happens to be what's called the N reactor. There was about 8 of these reactors built right along the edge of the Columbia River. The reactor building here itself is this building right here. The rest of these are pumping stations for water and support buildings and that sort of stuff. This reactor was the most unusual one in that it was used not only to create plutonium from uranium, but also to generate electric power. So it was a dual purpose reactor. But the one I want to talk about is the next one called the N reactor. And I took a tour of this. Here's our tour bus and me standing in front of this building. This was the very first nuclear reactor built in the United States that was a full-scale production. The very first reactor built by mankind was built at the University of Chicago by Enrico Fermi. And it only put out a couple of watts. But it was the one that got the first chain reaction in uranium. And they proved the physics. And because the Manhattan Project was a very ambitious, extremely fast schedule, They went from a first prototype to a full-scale production reactor in one fell swoop. They designed this thing, which is about a 250, I don't remember the exact numbers. Anyway, it's a big reactor. So let me show you what it looks like on the inside, because this is fascinating. And by the way, this is now considered a National Historic Site. So this is the front of the reactor. This is the front of this huge block of carbon, graphite. And there's several thousand holes drilled through here, and each of those holes is filled with tubes of uranium. Now, the guy that designed this reactor was Enrico Fermi, and he designed a circular pattern for the uranium rods to go in here, and he said, that's the right size, and that'll do the trick. They chartered DuPont to do the actual work, and the chief scientist at DuPont was a very experienced and smart engineer. And he said, I'm just going to put a little fudge factor in. And so he built in the corners a few extra holes in each of the four corners of this giant block. You can see how big it is compared to the size of a man, of graphite. And he just did it even though it wasn't part of the specs, because he had experience and he knew that things don't always work out exactly like they're supposed to. So they loaded this thing full of uranium tubes. They pulled the control rods out, and it came up to power, and it worked the very first time. It's the most miraculous piece of physics, science, engineering that you can even believe. For the first time, they were doing this. And it worked great for 2 or 3 days. And then the power started to taper down, and nobody knew why. So they shut the reactor down, they started analyzing it. And what they found was some of the uranium in these center things here had started generating extra xenon, and the xenon was sucking up all the neutrons, and that's what shut the reactor down. So they said, what are we going to do? And the DuPont engineer says, well, how about we put a little extra uranium in these corner ones, and that'll overcome the poisoning of the xenon, and holes are already there, just go ahead and stick them in. So they did that, and it worked, and it overcame the xenon poisoning, and from then on, it worked fine. Now, the thing about the Ukrainian reactor is if they had learned the lesson that we learned back in 1943 at the B Reactor, the first one we built, they would have known that xenon poisoning will change the characteristics of a nuclear reactor, but they didn't take that lesson to heart. Okay, so let's move on then. Here, a little more explanation. Here's the graphite block. It's full of thousands of these holes. You shove uranium tubes in here. You let it cook for about a week, maybe 2 weeks, depending on the age of the reactor. When you're all done, you put the control rods in, shut it down. You take some long pokers and you shove these uranium tubes out. They're about 8 inches long. And they go plop, plop, plop down here into this bucket of water. And you remotely pick them up because they are radioactive as hell. And you haul them off to another facility. Well, here's what the uranium rods look like. The ones in the center, they're zirconium coated. They're about 8 inches long and 2.5 inches in diameter. And the ones on the end are a little different configuration. And you haul them down to a plutonium finishing plant, which is this enormous building. It's about 1,000 feet long, about 3 football fields in length. It's all big, thick concrete cells. There's about 50 of these cells in here. And each one is a different chemical process. And it is all remote controlled behind thick glass and with robot arms. And so if you think about what we did in the Manhattan Project, they went from nothing to 50,000 people living in the city of Richland, all learning new skills to how to extract plutonium from irradiated rods of uranium. And when you're all done with that, you've got tons and millions of gallons of toxic waste. And what do they do with the toxic waste? Well, they built these steel tanks to store the toxic waste. They didn't know what to do with it, and they thought, we're only going to build a couple atomic bombs and it'll be over. We'll win the war and we'll shut this whole thing down. So they built these tanks to last 25 years. And they put all this toxic waste in these tanks, and they covered it up. And then the Cold War came along, and they said, oh, build a lot more plutonium. And they were overwhelmed by toxic waste. Well, these tanks started to leak, and they've been leaking ever since. They've been building new tanks with double walls and trying to pump these out, but this stuff is sludge. Some of it's solid, almost like concrete. It's all radioactive. It's got all these terrible chemicals in it, and that's the mess they've got at Hanford. Some of this stuff is leaking into the groundwater and slowly creeping over the Columbia River. So what they've been doing with Hanford for the last several decades is trying to clean up the mess. Just for interest, here's what the town of Richland looked like a year after the Manhattan Project started. There's this little shopping industrial area, and then the 50,000 people all living in Quonset huts, probably similar to what we have here at China Lake in 1946 when they built our plant here. And of course, it's the atomic city, so all the businesses have logos like that. And then this book I read about the school children were all 4 years old when Chernobyl occurred. They were 14 years old when they started writing letters back and forth between Ukraine and Richland. So here's the US students at 14 years old. They were junior high school students. And they started writing letters and telling the story of what it's like to live in an atomic city. And here's the Ukrainian students who sent letters back to the US and telling them what it's like to live in an atomic city and be uprooted when you're 4 years old and start a new life. And here's the two teachers, which had this, Maureen McQuarrie was the one who got the idea of doing this exchange with the people that lived in Pyrpyat, eventually Slavutych. And here's the Ukrainian teacher, Tatiana, who did the same thing. And then here the kids are. They took a trip to Ukraine, and they visited unit number 3, which is one that was still running. And here they're standing on top of the nuclear reactor, and here's some of the American students. And here they are wearing their Letterman's jackets saying the atomic city. And here's the city of Slavutych today. They realize now that the nuclear power plants have all been shut down. They need to do something to make a living. So what they're trying to do is create a research lab to connect the intellectual talent and experience of the workforce into some productive endeavor. So that's the connection between Hanford and the Ukraine and the Chernobyl thing. And I'm going to turn this back over to Forrest. Oh, let's see, that shows that the city of Slavutych is alive and people are having normal lives and having a great time.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Certainly.
When you say enriched uranium, what does that mean? More concentrated, or?
Uranium, when you dig it out of the ground, is almost entirely U-238, which is natural uranium. Uranium is element number 92. It has 92 protons and has 238 protons plus neutrons in it. And it's radioactive, but it has 0.7% U-235 in it, naturally. It turns out U-235 is a more active isotope of uranium. And it is a much better, well-behaved fuel for nuclear reactors. So in order to get the optimum performance from a nuclear reactor, you need to increase the percentage of U-235 from 0.7% up to, say, 8%. And then you get a very good nuclear reactor for generating heat and power. If you want to use uranium to make a bomb, you need to enrich it to somewhere between 40 and 90%, because then you can get more neutrons generated once you start a chain reaction. So when you worry about uranium, like we worry about Iran creating a bomb, we worry about their ability to convert uranium-238 into uranium-235. That's not easy to do. It's extremely difficult to do. And we talk about these centrifuges because there's a different atomic weight between U-235 and 238. One is a little denser than the other. You can use a centrifuge to separate them, but it's an extremely dangerous and arduous process. And so that's the big deal about atomic weapons, is enriching uranium. Okay.
There's also a gaseous diffusion plant.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
The gaseous diffusion plant at Oak Ridge where they were.
Right, there's about 4 methods of separating U-235 from U-238. One is a centrifuge, gaseous diffusion, cyclotron is another one, and there's a fourth one, I can't remember what it is. They're all extremely difficult to implement. It requires enormous industrial plants and extremely good engineering science and a lot of patience. Okay, any more questions? Turn it over to Forrest.
Okay. We're going to try to hit the environmental here a little bit, and I'm in an area where I don't know a whole lot, and I'm going to count on John here to fill in. We went out on the river. Wherever you got a nuclear powerhouse, you got to have some way of cooling the steam after it goes through the turbine. And they used the river here for that, and they were building cooling towers. And if you've ever seen plants where we have these gigantic silos that go way up in the air and you see moisture coming out of them, those are cooling towers. And they were building those at this plant because I assumed that they were having environmental problems. They were heating the water up too much. So what you're looking at here is a barge that after the accident it got so contaminated that they had to abandon it. So they took it and they just ran it up on the beach, and it's been sitting there ever since, rotting. And it turns out that there's lots of them. And I got a picture here. That's all equipment that had to be abandoned because of this accident. And the cost of this accident is just astronomical. This is also a big fishery. They had to shut down the fishery. They were getting huge amounts of fish out of there for food. These are catfish. They're six feet plus. They haven't been genetically altered. That's not why they're so big. They're so big because you can't eat them. They're radioactive. So they've been unmolested by man. And so that's why they're so big. So, yeah. I can't imagine swimming in water and have one of them come up beside you. They might eat you. So anyway, that's that.
How do they survive in this?
What's that?
How do they survive? Their bottom feeding.
Oh, they have absorbed radiation in their body and they haven't died. They have survived. I don't know how many of them die, how many of them survived. Those are good questions, and maybe someone knows the answer, but I don't know what it is. That was beyond the scope of our trip.
Simpler species are not as complicated as we are.
So maybe that's one of the reasons. For you people that attended the talk I gave at the USO, I put out some bum information, and I'm going to correct it now. This farm is I think 10 kilometers away from the nuclear plant, and I thought that the ground was contaminated, and John corrected me on that. It's not contaminated, it's east, and the winds blew to the west when this accident happened. So they let some of these people come back and live here because the ground's not contaminated, but they're living in a gated community. And it's not the kind of gated community that most of us are thinking of here. But it was interesting. This farmer and his wife, they're fairly elderly, and they're growing their food and living off the land. And I don't know what they went through to get there, but I imagine it was a challenge to get the government to let them go in there. You got to go through a locked gate to get in and in and out. So. Is there any questions on the environment that you want to ask that if I can't answer, maybe John can?
A couple questions. So the fauna moves around and it can be radioactive like your catfish. So by virtue of them moving around, wouldn't they kind of continually spread the concentrate of radioactive, or when they die, they would actually contribute in more of a concentrate? And then the other thing is, does it matter if it's a root vegetable or if it's an above ground vegetable? Like you know, does it make any difference at all whether or not it could become contaminated or concentrate anything?
You know what? I don't know the answer to that. I'll tell you this. I'll tell you one thing that I found very interesting. It rained a lot while we were there, and we all had radiation detectors on us. That was required to be worn. And one of the people took their detector and they put it on wet asphalt and wet concrete, and it didn't register. And then there was a crack, and there was grass growing up, and he put it over that, and that detector screamed. And my interpretation of that is that the radioactive dirt got washed down into that crack, and then plants grew and brought some of that stuff up through the plant. Is that, John?
Yeah, that's fine. Peter, please ask that question again, maybe at the end, and I'll field that question and maybe a couple others, so.
Yes, sir.
Save that.
Is this a good time to do that, John?
Go ahead, Forrest. Why don't you go ahead?
Well, okay. All right, we'll move on. I tried to come up with some numbers. Oh, yes.
I got a question. Has these people that they moved out, are they monitoring the health of these people?
Are they what?
The people are they monitoring their health? I mean,
That'll be a question for John when John comes up. He'll have to answer that one. You want to say a word about that?
Yes, they've been doing continuous studies of the entire population of people from the time the accident occurred to the time these books I read were written, which was year 2000. So they've got 24 years of history, and every year the school kids said they go back and have all sorts of medical tests done and see how they're doing. So the answer is yes, they're spending a lot of money monitoring the people to be sure they're safe, but also to try to learn as much as they can about radioactive hazards and effect on biosystems and
Future nuclear wars.
Yeah.
No.
Absolutely.
I think you got another question.
You know, the people who have died from radiation poisoning, especially in the beginning, did they ever treat those bodies or anything like radioactive waste? You know, they had to be disposed of in a different area, or some not a regular cemetery, anything like that?
Well, actually there were not a lot of people killed right away. There were, as Forrest showed, there were, I don't know, half a dozen or so killed immediately, and then there was probably 40 or 50 people that had received very strong doses, and a large percentage of those died. I can actually look up the numbers in one of these books. The interesting thing about radioactivity is there are a number of different radioactive isotopes that are created in a disaster. There are two really bad actors, cesium-137 and strontium-90. Each of those have a half-life of about 30 years. So when those are created, you get a radioactive element that lasts a long time. It takes 30 years for its radioactivity to go in half, another 30 years to go in half again. And after about 100 years, you're down to a few percent, and it's basically gone. There are some others, like iodine, that have a much shorter half-life, but the problem is they're so highly radioactive, if you get just a few micrograms of it in your system. And they were really worried about the iodine being soaked up by the plants, and the cows eat it, and it gets in the milk, and the children drink the milk. So that was a real bad problem in the initial. So the radioactivity hazard kind of changes character as time goes by.
Different body parts.
I think this is a good time for John to say
John
a few
can
words.
All right, so I do want to make a comment or two about this. I appreciate the comments that have been made about cesium-137 and strontium-90, but the additional matter to consider about these are both biologically active, as is iodine-131. And cesium-137, right, it's in the first column of the periodic table. So this substitutes quite well for calcium. And strontium-90 substitutes strontium-90 substitutes for calcium, and cesium-137 for potassium. So these particular isotopes can be absorbed. And you'll find, for example, with fish scales or with antlers of animals, and this goes to your question, that these are radioactive. the fish scales, the antlers, and so forth, because the animal has processed strontium, and because it's chemically so similar, because of its placement in the periodic table, it's found in those particular structures. Now, the good thing about iodine-131 is that the half-life is only 8 days. And so it decays very, very quickly. As a consequence, it is very radioactive because the decay rate is so high. There are other isotopes that live a very long time. We mentioned uranium-238. I mean, the decay events in uranium-238 are relatively slow because it's fairly stable, right? Which means on a per gram basis in terms of decay, or I should say on a per mole basis, the decay rate means that it's going to last a long time. It means that the decay events per second are going to be less than something that's very, very radioactive because the half-life is very short. It's very unstable, if that makes sense. Okay. The other comments I want to offer here now, sort of as background, is that I like Forrest bringing us this point about the farmer, and he's a charming, charming man in probably his early 80s now with his wife. He related to us the story of how he was going fishing and how he confronted a wolf. Not once, but twice. Of course, we asked him if he could own a gun, and the answer is absolutely not. But the fauna have moved back into Chernobyl, and when we went into the zone, Sergei gave us a little talk and said, now, you have to watch out for the wild boars. You know, the dogs are usually friendly, but there are also other animals, deer, elk, and wolves. Right, so these have moved back, and probably bear as well. There's nobody to hunt them, although probably some people do poaching. But the other comment I want to make in this is that when we think about the distribution of radioactivity in the Chernobyl zone, it's highly variable because it was deposited via atmospheric dispersion. And large particles have a high terminal settling velocity. They would settle out pretty quickly. Small particles less so. And so if you look at a contour map of where cesium-137 went, or iodine-131, it's not really possible to predict this in the sense that it's not a very even distribution. It's empirically determined. In fact, that's what Sergei was doing on his tour with the Army, was he was making radiation measurements with a radiation reconnaissance company to develop contour maps of the zone and where radioactivity was and where it wasn't. And so, again, as we heard just a moment ago, I mean, the good thing about this, even with cesium-137 and strontium-90 with a half-life of 30 years, I mean, we see about half of that compared with what we used to. And if we looked at a table of the overall mass of isotopes and the overall radiation of those isotopes, you know, most of that went away. I mean, within a few months. And the gases were, you know, blown around and didn't really stay any place. Okay, so a lot of that initial radioactivity, which was so high, has gone away. And since I'm talking about this, I want to say two more things. The radiation I got the first time we went to the zone was 2/3 of the radiation I got on the round-trip plane flight from Zurich to Phoenix, or Phoenix to Zurich and back, right? The second time, I got less radiation than that, with my 2 days in the exclusion zone measured with a dosimeter. Although I believe in Mr. Reagan's statement, trust but verify, I carry my own gamma ray detector, which I purchased myself, right? So one of the things I want to do for you, I have a tablet here, and I could pass this around because we're thinking of another visit. It's kind of, there's a certain magnetism, if that's the right word for this place. We're planning to go back again, maybe even a fourth time. So if you're interested in possibly going with us, and I realize in a group this size that usually means, well, because this is Ridgecrest, it might mean 3 or 4 people. 2 of those people, though, will decline after they've talked to their spouse about it, as he or she will not let them go. But there might be a couple of you that would enjoy this visit, and we're very careful of safety, and we know Sergei and so forth. We have good contacts in Ukraine. So I'm going to pass around a sheet, and if you're interested in being on a mailing list for the future, you can give me your email and a name. And also we have an article coming out in Western Arborist that talks a little bit about the biota. It talks about trees. Now, Western Arborist is a trade magazine. There's a peer-reviewed paper in the works too, okay? But this is a PDF, galley-proof, and so we'll have this out fairly soon, I think. If you'd like to copy the PDF, again, just give me an email, please, and your name, and I will be happy to send that to you. I'm including this comment now in the previous one, so I stick to my promise that I had two things to say. I appreciate the references that have been shown. A very good scientific reference, the best I know of, and I just am not aware of these other books, is The Lessons of Chernobyl. Burlakova and Nadich are the editors. You can get this from Nova Scientific, but there are a series of chapters about Chernobyl, about the accident, about radiation, about biota, about where the radiation went. And what's really interesting, I think, about this is that the Soviets were very interested in this topic. And they've done a lot of research in kind of how to prepare organisms for exposure, how to deal with exposure after the fact. And they were very, very interested in this because I think of their view toward protecting the population if they could, and civil defense and so forth. So again, I'll have this book for you to have a look at if you wish. I realize not many of you may wish to purchase it, but at least you're aware of it. If you had an interest down the road, you could have a look at it.
There's another book that I'd recommend. It's called Voices from Chernobyl, and it's a story written by a Ukrainian lady and translated into our language. It's a Nobel Prize winner for 2015, available on Amazon. It's ebook. It's much more the human toll that this took.
Right, and I appreciate that comment. Can we go back to the previous slide for us for a second here? I think that's quite an accurate representation of the death toll. And the firefighters that came in on the second wave to fight the fires, all of them succumbed. Because the first wave of firefighters set up a perimeter, the second wave went in to fight the fires. So there were about 32 right there. That was the toll. There was one person who died in an accident inside, maybe two in the steam explosion and so forth. So I can appreciate the reference to the Nobel Prize winner's work. There's a great deal of emotional content in that work, right? It's not dispassionate, but not that this topic should be dispassionate necessarily because of the lives that were affected, right? So it's written from another perspective, and I would just offer that sense about that particular reference.
I think the economic slide is next.
Yes.
Oh, okay. This was a page out of the book that talked about the accident, and it attempts to break down the total cost of this accident in the Ukraine. And you notice the first line is the direct loss of the equipment, and it represents 1.3, I can't read it, $385 billion. No,
1.385 billion.
Billion, yeah. That's the cost in millions of US dollars. So, okay, I mean, that's bad, but not too bad. But then if you look at the expenditures for remediation of the accident from 1986 through 1991, and then the cost from 92 to 97, you're adding another $10 billion. That's billion. Those are thousands of millions. And then, so the total direct losses are about $11 billion. But then they went on to calculate the economic impact of the entire economy in that area of Ukraine. All the fishing was lost, all the agriculture, all the industrial businesses that depended on those power plants are gone, and all the future business they were counting on to develop their economy was pretty well wiped out because these 4 nuclear power plants were shut down. The total cost then was $120-some billion. So the significance of that is it's a few bucks. But I would suggest, and the book suggests, that that was a significant factor in the downfall of the Soviet Union. They were undergoing some other problems too at the time, but this was probably not an insignificant factor. The other thought I'd like to leave with you is that this amount of damage by an explosion that they estimated at about 30 tons of TNT. The smallest atomic bomb detonated was about 15,000 tons of TNT on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, atomic bombs. So those were 15 kilotons. If you look at a hydrogen bomb or a thermonuclear bomb, we're talking about 3 to 15 megatons of explosive power.
The Russians did one that was almost 100 megatons.
They did one that was 49 megatons up in that Novo something, Novo, that island up in the Arctic. Yeah, 49 megatons. So put that in perspective. I mean, we're talking orders of magnitude between this and a small atomic bomb, and another 3 orders of magnitude between an atomic bomb and a hydrogen bomb. So nuclear power can have enormous destructive consequences. Okay.
Compiling a chart like this for Fukushima?
I don't know. I suspect they are.
I expect you'll never find out.
Don't know. Let's see, John, you have a comment.
Well, I want to say something in the context here for Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There was, of course, with Chernobyl, there was no blast or pressure wave associated with this accident, right? The radiation released at Chernobyl was 200 times that of Hiroshima plus Nagasaki combined. And it had to do with the total mass of the radionuclides involved. So that's a reason that this event did so much damage. It did it in a different way than an atomic explosion would.
We touched on this a little bit. You know, being from Ridgecrest, China Lake, and the USSR collapsed, and I thought a lot about that and tried to understand what caused it to crash. And the reasons that seemed to pop up most often was it was a financial disaster for the USSR, and between the Afghan War, Star Wars, overspending on defense, and Chernobyl, it was a financial disaster which brought it down. So I put this question to Sergei. I said, so you guys collapsed because of money? He says, absolutely not. He says money had nothing to do with it. He says it was perestroika. When everybody found out what was going on, the people were outraged. And it was their outrage and being so upset that he claims is what brought the USSR down. And I know one of the things that happened, a lot of people in Russia didn't know how many soldiers were being killed in the Afghan war. And when those numbers came out and the women started talking between themselves, that was a disaster. So I just wanted to share his perspective of why the USSR collapsed versus mine, and probably a lot of people here.
Forrest, is there any comment from the guides and so on about the Russians, as a part of the Soviet Union, built Chernobyl, but the Soviet Union came apart, now it's a Ukrainian problem?
You know, I'll touch on that. Sergei, he was a really interesting guy, and I really enjoyed talking to him. And he was in the Russian army. So I said to him, I said, what's that? Yeah, it's Russian army. I said to him, I said, let me get this right. You're from the Ukraine, but you were in the Russian army, and every place that I looked around, everybody's trying to distance themselves from the Russians. The Ukrainians want to regain their identity, and they're changing the names of their museums. They're discouraging people from learning Russian. And so I asked their guy, I said, how do you deal with this? Is this hard for you? He looked at me, he says, it's really hard. He says, I was loyal to the Soviet army, and now I'm struggling with re-identifying myself as a Ukraine. So that was a very enlightening question and answer for me, and I can relate to that. So does that kind of give you some Does that kind of answer your question?
I have a question for us. What do they charge for this tour?
I don't know, the whole trip cost me $3,000. I think it was like $800. That sound about right? Yeah.
$850 for the land portion, then plus air.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think, relatively speaking, this wasn't a terribly expensive trip. And one of the things that made it really exciting, I think, is that I enjoyed all the people that were on the trip. It was a good group of people, and John did an excellent job of organizing everything. And it's not easy to put a trip like this together with 11 people, and they're all opinionated, and they're all alphas, and we all got along, and there was no fights. So I'd say it went pretty good.
I wasn't on the trip, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Bring up an observation here regarding the comment regarding Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and also Matt's comment about engineering. Way back in the mid-'60s, I was in graduate school with physics. A classmate of mine was a man named Kojiro Nishina. His father, Nishina, was a Nobel laureate. He was probably the #1 physicist of pre-war Japan. The Klein-Nishina scattering cross-section is well known in physics. Nishina, his father, was the first man to go into Hiroshima after the bomb was dropped. And he died as a result of it. Kojiro said his father did that to commit harakiri, because he had assured the emperor that it was not possible to build an atomic bomb. That he said everybody knows the physics, but nobody can overcome the engineering to refine U-238 or the plutonium to build a bomb in fissionable quantities. And we did. And so he died as a result of that.
Okay.
And Bud Sewell was part of the Army crew that was in Japan after World War II to dismantle the Japanese nuclear program to see how far they'd gotten.
Well, this concludes the nuclear accident part of this. If anyone's interested, I could discuss some other things that I observed over there that I found interesting. But you all have been sitting here a really long time.
Your demographics of male and female.
Yeah, you did.
Okay. When I went over there, I didn't speak the language, so I couldn't communicate with men or women. But so I observed. Okay.
Isn't it universal?
Probably. But the women stood out. They were dressed in bright clothes, all the way from little kids all the way to old people, and they were outgoing, and they weren't embarrassed about their sexuality, and they were just right out there. And the men, well, I mean, they weren't bashful. You could tell how they engaged people, in conversation and stuff, and they just came across as very feminine.
Kind of American women, you're saying.
Well, I'll get to that in a minute. So I watched all this, and I thought, wow, this is interesting. And the men were dressed in drab clothes. They were low-keyed. They didn't present themselves like the women do in any way. So I'm looking at all this, and I'm trying to understand it. So when I get to my motel room, and I hook into the internet, I start getting all this stuff about escort service. Now, I don't know about people in this room, but when I think of escort service, I'm thinking prostitution or buying sex or whatever. So I started reading them. It had nothing to do with sex. These women, first off, they spoke English because I can only read English. And they talked about, one of them said, I got 2 degrees, and another one had 3 degrees, and they spoke multiple languages. And they said, yeah, I'm good looking. They were upfront about that. And they said, if I'm hanging on your arm and you go into a business environment, you'll be proud of me. I'll handle myself in a very professional way, and I know how to do business. Well, I thought myself, I'm trying to put this all in perspective. So why is the people in the Ukraine like this, and over here, I see it switched the other way around. The men are the ones that are out there, trying to look good and impress the women, and The women, I think, are a little more kicked back in this country and reserved. So when I got home, I started doing some research, and I found out that the male-female ratios in this country and the Ukraine are drastically different. A lot of men were killed over there in wars. For every 100 women, there's 85 men. And the men don't take care of themselves as well as the women. They drink too much, they smoke too much, and they die younger. And over there, they're poor. There's not much resources. Men aren't going out looking for a woman to marry until they're in their 30s. These women, if they're not married by 25, people look at them and say, what's your problem? Well, there's not enough men to go around. So they have places over there where they encourage men to come over and marry them. Well, at the hotel, there was a man from Belgium who had decided he fell in love with this Ukraine woman, and he was having a bad time. The woman wanted his money, but she didn't want him. And he couldn't figure out what was wrong. Well, the problem was, he was looking for a wife to go home, be the take care of the house and the kids and stuff. This woman wanted a career. So when men show up over there and they're interested in these Ukraine women, they better understand that these women are career-oriented. If you're not providing a career for them, you're in big trouble. So and if you look at the ratios, in this country, roughly a woman has a 2-to-1 advantage at 20. Now, there's lots of reasons for that. You can look at when men marry and when women marry. But the bottom line is men got to compete hard for the women over here. Over there, the number is somewhere between, I've heard 3.5 to 1. Men have an advantage over women, somewhere between 3.5 to 1 and 8 to 1. When you got those kind of ratios, that means the women have to hustle to get them in, and there's just not enough of them. And so a woman, to survive over there, she's got to be able to make a living. She's got to have a career. She's got to have it together. So anyway, I found that very interesting.
That's interesting, yes, thank you.
Yes.
You remember those statistics really?
As the organizer for the last 2 previous tours, let me say that this particular line of discussion is completely new to me and a surprise. Nor was it part of the planned program that we had in Ukraine that had to do with biology and physics, plant biology, that is. So I think what I learned from this is that people who do travel with us have additional learning opportunities that they create for themselves. But that particular subtopic was not part of any agenda that I developed for the group. So just set the record straight.
Good job, Forrest.
All right. Any yes, Kay?
Talk about the corruption.
You want to hear about corruption? My brother and I get off the airplane. We're supposed to have a bus waiting for us from the hotel. We can't find one anywhere. So here we are, speaking only English, and we're looking around, scratching our head. Had a couple taxi cab drivers come up to us. We kind of shunned them. And then this one guy came up, and he says, I'm here to pick up a person, and if he agrees, I can give you a ride to your hotel, my brother and I and our luggage, but the person I came to pick up has to give me permission to do that. I said, well, that's fine. Well, the guy gets off the airplane, he says, fine. Well, he was from one of the other East European countries, and the conversation that we had from the airport to our hotel, which was probably about 30 or 40-minute drive, was most enlightening. These 2 men are business people, and they were not only business people, but the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, which is one of the best organizations, I think, for doing humanitarian work around the world. I dealt with that organization for 3 years on a Rotary project, and they were paying 100 people, businessmen scattered all over Eastern Europe, to evaluate corruption that interfered with the ability to do business. And these 2 men were meeting to do some more of those discussions, and what they shared with us is that it's all over Europe, Eastern Europe, I'm talking about Eastern Europe, and they said you cannot be successful in the business world because of it, and they decided to investigate and identify who is the corrupt people, and they put together what would be essentially be a detective going out and putting together a plan to go to court to prosecute, what a prosecutor would use to prosecute these people. They got it all together, and they went to see the district attorney. And the district attorney says, oh my goodness, this is terrible. So what he did is he closed down the bank where this all activity was going, and they all went to another bank, and no one got arrested. And so that's a problem for Eastern Europe. And then I told him that, you know, we really got our politics together over here. And he chuckled because he understood that we're struggling with our Democrats and our Republicans and all that. But anyway, that was very enlightening to me. And then I've got a couple articles that I've read since then that validates everything that he told me. And they had nothing but good to say about the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Yes, Kay?
The Ukraine Army is not paid at all, the soldiers?
You know, I'm a little careful about that. I haven't done much research on it, but on the airplane coming back, we met a man from Long Island, and he was over there. He had some friends that had a band, and he went over there to help the band, and what the band was doing is raising money to pay for the Army over there. And what he explained to me is the Army is unpaid. They don't have uniforms. They don't have warm clothes. They come with their own weapons, and they're trying to build up a defense system to be able to deal with the Russians, because the Russians are right on the other side of the border. And so I haven't researched that a whole lot, and I don't want to stand up here and tell you that they don't have an army. But this man had donated a lot of his time to help raise money for the Army over there to try to get them strong. The other thing that was interesting is my brother and I had dinner with two men who are UN observers, and they were there they were in Kiev getting training on what to do if a terrorist catches them and how to handle that situation. And we've got lots of UN observers up and down that border, and their job is to watch the Russians, and when the tanks start rolling, they're supposed to pick up the phone and call home and say, we've got a problem. So anyway, that's a little bit of information that I picked up on this trip.
You weren't worried at all over there that something might happen because of all the tension?
You know, I wouldn't have gone over there if I thought there was a problem. I went on the internet, I checked with our State Department. They said, no problem, you go over there, you have a good time, but don't go down to the south in, what's the name of that town? Crimea. They didn't want us near Crimea. Well, that wasn't a problem. I wasn't going to Crimea. But I'll also share with you that even though I checked and we had communication over there with the federal government, my brother and I had compass, we had a map, we had a GPS, and between us we had $600 in small bills of US dollars. And if things would have gone south, John and I and a group of us, if we had to, we could have walked out of that country. We would have done whatever we had to. So that's the way my brain works. I try to have backup plans when things go haywire. But I wasn't worried about it, and I was willing to I didn't think it was a big risk. So that's how I dealt. And John tells me that he had a lot of contacts, and he may have had a better plan than my brother and I did. But we didn't need to execute it. Yeah.
Did you have to fly on Aeroflot planes?
No. We went in British Airways. In United and British Airways, I think they're working together.
All the way to Kiev?
No. We flew into London, and then we took a flight from London to Kiev. My brother lives on the East Coast, so I went to visit him, spent a week with him before we left. So we flew out of New York, and we went we flew out of Philadelphia. Flew out of Philadelphia to London, and then from London to Kiev. And then we came back the same way. You know, good airlines, comfortable, lots of security. Well, we went through London. Part of the other group went through France, and my understanding is that when that airplane was airborne, all that bad stuff happened, all that shooting and stuff. But I don't think they closed down the airport for that. So it wouldn't have affected.
We got through the airport just before those events happened, and by the time we came back there, things had settled down a lot. Yeah.
And I don't worry about those things. I have no control over them. I'm not going to live a life of fear, so. Anything else? Yes?
Other than the catfish, was there any other significant animal, like differences in the animal's characteristics around the area?
I didn't see any, Alex. No, that doesn't say it's not there. I'm just saying that I didn't see it. You know, we had a limited amount of time, and so, yeah, didn't see any of that. Okay.
Okay. Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Good night.
No gap. It's always interesting.